Welcome back to another episode of the Empower Grief Journey podcast. I'm your host, Chris Mamone, and I'm an acceptance coach who helps people heal from grief, loss, and trauma to discover their self acceptance and step into their personal power. This podcast is your dedicated space for healing, growth, and transformation. Each episode shares insightful and inspirational stories, along with practical tools and actionable insights that can help guide you along your healing journey. Today, I have a special guest with us. Her name is Jane. After losing her teenage son to suicide, a loss that came without warning, Jane founded Bright Futures Coaching. She specializes in teen mindset, confidence, and parent teen communication. And she now works to ensure no teen feels as disconnected from the world as her son did. Through her work, she helps parents and teens open up and build stronger relationships and step away from social media and make conversations about emotions parts of everyday life. So, without further ado, I want to welcome Jane onto the podcast. Jane, welcome to the show.
Hi, well, thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to be able to share my story and potentially help others with their loss, and help them move forward because it's grief is not an easy thing to get over. So, I find it empowering to be able to share and help others. So I lost my son in February 2023. After a very short battle with mental health. I suspect it was slightly longer than that, but we only became aware of it when he told us in November 2022 that he was struggling with depression. Um, we've since found out that he had disclosed to his doctor that he was having suicidal thoughts at that point, but he never disclosed them to us. So for us, we thought we were dealing with depression. He reached out, he sought help, he did all the things that they tell you to do, and um, shared it with friends. He had a really supportive network around him, but obviously it became too much for him, and we didn't really know the true depths of it. So in February 2023, he decided he couldn't go on any longer, and took his own life, which it did come as a complete shock to us. And I do remember the day that the police turned up on our doorstep, just thinking, gosh, it must have been an accident or somebody else must have been involved. We didn't think that suicide was even a possibility. But obviously, as time went on, we realized that that was the reality. That's what had happened. Um, and so it's almost like a double whammy because it's something so unexpected and something that you read about in the news. It doesn't happen to people like us. It feels like it's a distant thing, until it happened. Um, and it hit us really hard because we just had no idea. I could show you so many photos of Leo. He had a big group of friends. He was popular. He was outgoing. He was sociable. He was successful. He was doing really well on his course at university. He just, in the last 6 months before he died, he'd qualified as a professional diver. So, there were no real warning signs that he was at risk, or that this would become our reality. Um, so yeah, so since then, it's been a journey, like I think acceptance is a really good word. It's been a journey of acceptance. It's not been a straightforward journey. Um, Grief isn't linear, which people tell you that, but I think until you experience it, you don't really realize what they mean. Um, and I have good days, I have bad days. I think I have more good days now than at the beginning. Um, and I also look back and realize that I was in shock for quite a long time at the start. I went into kind of organizer mode, sorting all the paperwork side of it, the practical side of it, all those things that have to happen. and thought I was coping really, really well. And then, had a few moments where I did properly crash and burn. So yeah, it really has been a roller coaster is how I describe it. And anybody going through grief will understand that. And anybody who hasn't experienced grief, may hear that and think, yeah, yeah, I understand that. But I think, as I say, until you've been in that situation, you don't realize how much of a roller coaster it is, and how you can go from a really bad day to a really good day and then back to a really bad day, um, on as part of that journey. So for me, what I've really tried to do and what's really helped me to move forward, um, has been to make something positive from Leo's legacy. And as you described at the beginning, I've now kind of made it part of my business. I was a teacher at the time that Leo died. I'd been a teacher for 27 years, working with teens. Um, I still work with teens. I find teens a really uplifting group of people to work with, and a really fascinating group of people to work with. And so yeah, I've kind of turned Leo's legacy into a purpose and a passion, really, to help not just teenagers, but also help their families to reconnect, because I think the teen years can be quite hard for some families. So yeah, help them reconnect, help them open up, and make talking about feelings just part of everyday life, particularly with teenage boys. I think sometimes they find that really hard because it's not classed as normal. People don't, there's the fallacy that boys should be strong and shouldn't show their feelings. And I think we need to change that in society. So that's part of my mission as well.
I appreciate you sharing a bit of your story with us up front here to get us started today, because I know going through a loss with suicide, especially a teenager in that instance, is a very, very hard thing to grasp. And it's also something, like you said, that I wanted to point out again, is just that this came very unexpected. There weren't a lot of signs there that were telling you this was going to happen. And here in America, and I know you're over in the UK, but the way we talk about suicide on a national side of things with radio advertisements and TV advertisements, stuff like that, it feels very disconnected from what suicide actually is and what actually goes on in that situation. And so I've had the not so much pleasure of talking to people who have lost somebody through suicide, whether it's been a teenager or someone in their 20s or even a family member. And to see the actual impact that that has on somebody, especially when it comes out of the blue and you don't even have a warning sign about it, really, it's a very devastating loss.
Yeah, and I think one of the things with suicide, I mean, up until fairly recently, I don't know about America, I assume it's similar, but certainly in the UK, um, it used to be a crime, which is why people say committed suicide. It was classed as a crime, as in homicide, suicide, fratricide, um, and the phrase committed suicide is no longer really used. People do still use it because I don't think they realize the connotations, but it does bring with it a little bit of a stigma. Um, and I think some people don't quite know how to deal with it. Some people don't know how to react when you tell them that it was a death by suicide. I think some people still find the word quite shocking. So it's a difficult grief to talk to people about because not everybody understands it. Um, and I think there's an assumption as well sometimes that suicide is a selfish act. Um, and because obviously it leaves behind such massive devastation, yet it's something that this person has, on the face of it, chosen to do. But as you say, it is far, far more complex. I mean, I know from the documents that we've had, because of course there's had to be an investigation, there's had to be an inquest. Um, Leo held on for a long time, and one of the things he told his doctor, again, didn't tell anybody else, was that he'd considered suicide prior to February 2023. but didn't act on it because he knew the impact that it would have on his family, as his parents, and the people around him. So, I don't think it's ever something that people do lightly. I mean, it's a huge trauma on the body when you look into it. So I've certainly never seen it as a selfish act, and I certainly don't believe that Leo did anything, deliberately to hurt anybody else or to make anybody else upset. It was, and in some ways they describe just suicide's described as not actually wanting to die, but not knowing how to live and not being able to
Mhm.
carry on. Um, and that's the way I see it with Leo, is that he reached a point where he just felt so low, he just couldn't see his place in the world and he didn't know how to carry on. And he saw no choice, which to me is incomprehensible as his mum, because we actually did have quite an open relationship. We did have we talked about pretty much anything. He talked about relationships, he talked about his girlfriends, he talked about university, but obviously this one thing, maybe he felt the stigma around it. I don't know. We'll never know because he's not here to tell us. Um, but yeah, a death by suicide does come with lots of other elements that you might not get from an illness or another circumstance, or maybe an accident. Because I think there is that connotation that somebody's chosen to do it, and therefore it's to some extent selfish. But that's not how I see it, and that's not how anybody who knows Leo sees it at all.
Yeah, I think that's a very big stigma that people project their idealisms of things in these moments. I think is what that is. And I've learned after talking to people who are suicidal or people who've attempted suicide, it's very much not it's not a selfish act the way people describe it. It really isn't. There's a lot
No,
of
it's
things that go into that thought process and go into that mindset. And the people that
yeah,
I've talked to in particular just didn't have the support around them that they should have gotten or the help they needed. And so I always see this part of things where had we been a little more aware of what was going on with them, had we actually given them support, they may not have actually done that. But it comes from this deep-rooted place of really feeling like you're not part of the world in so many facets of life, almost to an extent where you just don't see any way out other than that. And that's really it's really sad and very, very hard to see that happen in people, because
yeah.
we can't even fathom our own mortality at that point. Because when we hear about other people dying, like a grandparent or a father or a mother or somebody in our family passes away, it's just assumed as a natural part of life. And but when it comes to suicide, it's just very different perspective when that happens.
Yeah, and I think particularly with a child, I think, obviously in this case a teenager, but I think it's there's so much wrapped up in it. It's the wrong order of things. Your child shouldn't die before you do. And like you say, if it's a grandparent or a parent who's died, there is a natural order to that to some extent. And, I think you fully expect that during your lifetime, your grandparents will pass away, um, and your parents will pass away. But I don't think at any point you expect your child to pass away, and certainly not in circumstances like this, where I mean, Leo did actually tell his doctor that he had a good support network. He had some really close friends. He was at university at the time, so he was living with friends. There were seven of them in the house. They really looked out for him. He was open with them. They knew that he was struggling with depression. They knew he was on medication. Um, like I said before, he told us, and he did tell his doctor that his support network was 5 out of 5. But I think there was just that little part of him that he just couldn't reveal, that part that just felt so out of place and so sad, and deep down didn't know a way out. There was that one little part of him. My therapist described it as a Russian doll. that we have
Mm.
the outer parts that people show to the world, and then you have the smaller ones that you show to certain people but not to everybody, and then there's that teeny tiny one in the middle that you don't show to anybody, and that's the part that he wasn't able to share, which it is really hard as a parent, because you do think, gosh, I should have done this, I should have done that, I should have done more, I should have been there to support him. But like I say, he told his doctor he had a very good support network. He just wasn't able to share that element of it with us. And at the time, I'll be honest, I didn't know to ask. And I've since learned that that is one of the things that you should be direct and open with people who you might think are contemplating suicide, and actually ask them directly. And I didn't know that, but also it wasn't on my radar, so I didn't think to ask. And I do look back and I think maybe if I had asked, then things might have been different. But again, we don't know. I try really hard not to live with that guilt, because I think guilt can be quite destructive. And the fact is, I did what I could with the information that I had at the time. So to kind of beat myself up about what I didn't do and what might have been different, we don't actually know what might have had a different outcome. Obviously, like you say, there are stories of people who say what helped them, and people who've been suicidal and come out the other side and said it's because of X, Y, and Z. And so I do think, gosh, maybe if I'd done this, maybe if I'd done that, maybe if I'd done something differently. But ultimately, I'll never know. I'll never know. And I don't want to move forward, and I don't want to live my life looking backwards and living with the what ifs and the maybes, because I don't think that's helpful, and it won't bring Leo back. So my decision going forward has been very much about knowing that whatever I do won't change what's happened. I can't bring Leo back, no matter how much I wish for it, no matter how much I want it to happen. Nothing I do will bring him back. So actually wallowing in it and beating myself up about it, and with all the what ifs and the whys, isn't going to help. And I have a daughter as well, who is Leo's younger sister. It's not going to help her either to see me doing that. So I have made a conscious decision not to live with the questions and the guilt, and to try and move forward and to make something of it. So, sharing Leo's story is part of that, and that's a really important part of that for me. So I really appreciate opportunities like this, but also bringing that awareness to other families so that other families do know and may be able to help their child who might be going through something similar, and to kind of support them to know how to ask the right questions, and maybe how to get their child to open up and reveal that tiny, tiny Russian doll in the middle, so that we can help them, so that we can potentially, save somebody else's life. And that's really what drives me, is that thought that I can't change what's happened to us, but I might be able to change the outcome for somebody else. And that's obviously in its most drastic form. I mean, my hope is to reach families before they get to that crisis point. I mean, ultimately, I'm not a mental health trained therapist. I'm a teacher and a qualified coach. So yeah, my hope is to get early interventions and help make talking about feelings that normal part of conversation, so that they don't reach that point of desperation. So
Well, you brought
that's
up
what.
a big topic of guilt, which I'm really glad you brought that up, because I do think a lot of the very powerful emotions and grief that can be destructive are things like guilt and shame and blame. And it's
Yeah,
very easy for us to take on that other person's path, especially in suicide, to say like, well, if I only knew this, or if I'd known that, or if I'd asked this question, or if I'd seen that, And we can always blame ourselves very, very harshly. We can. We're our own worst critic. But I always say when you're going through grief, that guilt can be very destructive and not helpful. And the
Yeah,
reason is that if you live in that place, by the way, of absolute guilt and shame and blame over a situation, you're really taking on circumstances that were very much out of your control and you ultimately couldn't do anything about. And so it will very much change the perspective and your experience of things, but it also will always leave you feeling very broken and very apart in that process. And I think that the reason I'm saying all this is you brought up a powerful word when we started this podcast about acceptance. And I think that
yeah,
I'm an acceptance coach, and I tell people that acceptance is not meaning that we like it or we agree with the outcome or it's okay. It does not mean those things, but it means that we accept that situation fully for what it is, not what we think it is. And we allow ourselves to become the observer of that moment where we can think about the lessons or the blessings or the gifts in those moments. Because even in the worst of times, those always exist there in the realm of acceptance.
yeah. And it is such a powerful word because I think it it almost gives you permission to move forward. You kind of accept what's happened, and also accepting that you can't change what's happened, because the simple fact is, no matter what our past, no matter what's happened, we can't change what's happened in the past. And like you say, guilt, denial, all of those things are, to me, they're past emotions. They're emotions that live in the past. You can't feel guilty for something that you haven't done. You can't be in denial for something that hasn't yet happened. So they're all emotions that live in the past, and they're not. I'm not saying that people shouldn't feel them, because I think feelings are important, and I think it's important to talk about feelings. But I don't think they're helpful feelings for moving forward and for trying to live with whatever it is that's happened, whatever form of trauma or grief that has happened. That the guilt, the denial, the shame are not helpful emotions. They exist. And I think, acceptance is probably a word we need to use with those emotions as well. I think we need to accept that we will have moments where we feel like that, but we don't have to live in those emotions. We can feel them, accept them, and then we can look at moving on. And what I found really interesting is how Leo's friends have dealt with the grief. Bearing in mind they were all in their late teens at the time. Leo was 19 when he died, and his friends were of a similar age. And I actually found it really refreshing spending time. We didn't really know his university friends. We knew his friends from home, but we didn't know his university friends very well. And we've got to know them, and they've stayed in touch. And I found it really refreshing that they don't seem to dwell on the what ifs and the guilt and the shame and all of those things. There are feelings of those, and I think they all, particularly the friends that he lived with, did all question themselves, what could they have done differently? Why did they not see it? Leo had actually been out with his friends the night that he died, and they all said he seemed really upbeat, he seemed really happy, and a couple of them had commented to him that he seemed really happy. But of course, with hindsight, that is actually quite typical of somebody who's made that decision to end their life. Is they feel lighter, they feel happier. But his friends very quickly turned it into the memories and the positives, and one of his friends set up a photo sharing group where we could all share photos of Leo, and that was lovely because it was about the memories, it was about the good times. And actually, there are very few photos of Leo when he's not smiling and not laughing, because he did throw himself into life 100%, which I think made it harder for him when he realized that life wasn't making him happy. So I think he was a little bit of an all or nothing kind of kid, and it was almost like, well, if it's not making me happy, then it's got to be making me sad, and that, there's a lot wrapped up in that. Um, but yeah, I think young people do have quite a different view of grief to older generations. Traditionally we look at grief and we look at, particularly in some of the European countries where, somebody dies and you have a period where you have to mourn and you have to be wearing black and you have to kind of, your life shuts down for a little while. And I understand that from an honoring the dead point of view, but for me, seeing how Leo's friends dealt with it and how they made it about the joy of his life rather than the sadness of his death, it kind of turned it on its head for me, and I found that so helpful, and it definitely helped my daughter through it. um we actually had a number of events of celebration of life events which felt like the right thing to do, because as I say, Leo did love life, and it felt like we were celebrating his life rather than just focusing on his death.
Yeah, I think that that's a beautiful thing that you shared about the photo sharing site, because I think that basically, I really think that's a really great way to honor and celebrate somebody through a loss like this, because it really brings everybody together in that place of remembering the good times with that person, remembering favorite moments they had with them. I think what you brought up too about suicide is very a big indicator of what to look for. People that do make that choice, oftentimes leading up to that, do get in that place of feeling lighter, feeling that pressure come off themselves because they know
Yeah.
that it's going to be over soon, and they know that they want to go out with that idea of a happy moment or a happy memory or a good time with people. um, and I appreciate you sharing that, because this is what I've learned along my journey of talking to people in the realm of suicide, that there are all these signs that do happen, but they're very subtle. They're not very highly spoken or standing out's the way I want to call it. They're very subtle notifications of things, and I think that's why it's so hard to predict or know or even understand when these things are going to happen.
Yeah, and to me it felt very strange to start with. I couldn't understand why he would be out with friends and having such a great time, and then literally less than an hour later he chose to take his own life. But when you read into it, it is that feeling of lightness and knowing that the pain is going to be over, because that really is what leads someone to suicide, is the pain, and an unbearable level of pain that they feel somehow that their life is not worth carrying on, or they can't see a way where they can carry on. But as you say, the signs are very subtle. And I think for teenagers in particular, a lot of the other signs that I've now learned are signs are also quite typical teenage behavior. So sleeping more, um, not really wanting to get out of bed, not eating properly. So either eating too much or eating too little, and staying up late, not able to sleep at night, but then sleeping during the day. Now, if you spoke to most parents of teens, that's quite typical teen behavior. And I can see it all in Leo, in the weeks leading up to when he died. I can see all those things, but you just go, well, he's a teenager. Teenagers sleep a lot. Teenagers either eat a lot or they eat erratically. And I wouldn't have linked any of it to suicide. But the big thing for me, and the big sign that I do now realize I missed, was that he told us he felt sad all the time. And I didn't pick up on that as a sign of, I picked up on that as a sign of depression, but I didn't pick up on it as a sign that his depression was too great a burden for him to carry. And that's probably the one thing that I just think, gosh, I should have picked up on that. So I think the phrase he used was, I'm fed up of feeling sad all the time. And that's the point where I realized I should have said to him, are you thinking of taking your own life? Which may have allowed him to then talk about it, which may have allowed him to then take steps and for us to kind of support him in a different way to what we thought he needed. Because I think there's a big thing with teens as well is, and through my work coaching teens and working with families and teens, teens don't always want to be fixed. Sometimes they just want to be heard and they just want their feelings acknowledged. And again, that word acceptance, they actually just want their feelings to be accepted. And I think as parents, we often want to fix, and we come in with a solution or some kind of support, or we'll kind of try and put steps in place and say, well, how about trying this? How about trying that? And actually, I think what a lot of us want sometimes is just to be heard and just to be listened to. And I think in grief, that's similar. You know, obviously nobody can fix what we've been through, um, because the fixing is to bring that person back, and that's just not possible. But I do sometimes feel, and I'm in quite a few groups. I'm in groups of other bereaved parents. I'm in groups of people who've lost someone by suicide. And a lot of the time, people will post and it will just be a rant, and there isn't really a kind of point. They don't necessarily want any kind of advice or guidance. They literally just want to go, this is how I'm feeling today. And for people to go, yeah, I get it. I get that. And so sometimes just validating and acknowledging how somebody's feeling, whatever their circumstance, whatever reason they're sharing that with you, is can be really, really powerful and really, really important.
Well, I think what you just said is very powerful because that's what I coach people on grief in is that we cannot fix grief. That's the thing that I think
No,
society doesn't quite understand is that
yeah,
fixing means bringing that person back.
yeah,
That's for me, that would be bringing my stillborn child back. For you, that would be
yeah.
bringing Leo back. And unfortunately, we can't fix that.
Not
We
going to
can't
happen.
change that.
Yeah,
And so
yeah,
trying to fix a griever is probably one of the worst things you could possibly do.
yeah,
What grievers do want is exactly what you just said about teens. They want to feel seen, heard, and understood. And by the
yeah.
way, it doesn't have to make sense to you. It doesn't because it's not your
No,
journey, it's not your walk. But when
no,
you give somebody that space to feel seen and heard and understood, they can really come off that platitude very high. They can come down from it a lot and they can feel safe and comfortable enough to talk to you. And that's the place, by the way, that when people are going through very heavy thoughts or very heavy grief, when you create that space for somebody, you have no idea how much more easier that journey will become if you were to give somebody that gift of just giving them your presence.
yeah. And it what you've just said there has reminded me of something somebody said. So really sadly, about 6 months after Leo died, a friend came to me and said that somebody she knew, her daughter had been killed in a road accident. And this friend of mine said, you know, what should I say to her? What should I do? And I genuinely, at the time, I thought, I don't know, because there were obviously people did lots of things for us. Um, but the more I thought about it, the more I thought the most useful thing for me was not the people who said, how can I help? What can I do? Because I was not in any kind of brain space to know what I needed or know what I wanted. And actually, the people who helped me the most were the people who just came round with no expectations, no idea, no concept of trying to fix or support, but just literally an idea of, we need to go round, we need to just let them know we're here, and we need to just be there and listen. And I remember I've got three very, very close friends who've just been incredible throughout this whole journey. Um, And they came round the 2 days after we found out, and we found ourselves laughing. And I remember thinking, gosh, this is a bit weird because really we shouldn't, it's almost like, gosh, we shouldn't be laughing. But we found ourselves laughing because they'd created that space for me just to be me. And it's very easy for, particularly when it's a traumatic death or when it's an unusual death, so something like the death of a child, it's very easy for people to make that your identity. So you become a bereaved parent, or you become, oh, the mum whose son died of suicide. And what was really refreshing was that these friends just allowed me to be me. I hadn't become somebody different with them. I was just me, and something had happened to me, to our family, but it didn't change who I was, and it didn't change my relationship with them. And I found that to be the most useful thing. And also people who came and just made a decision to do something without asking me what I needed, or without asking me what they could do. They People just brought food and just left it on the doorstep and just said, I've just brought you some food, I've just left it on the doorstep. Or people would come and say, I'm going shopping, is there anything you need? And they would go shopping and buy some stuff and just bring it back. And I found that really useful. But I think, as I say, the most useful thing were those people who just were there and just listened and just allowed me to be me, but me with something different, something that had happened, and allowed me to talk about it if I wanted to talk about it, not talk about it if I didn't want to talk about it, and talk about something completely different that ended up making us laugh if we didn't want, if I wanted to do something. But it was all very much, it felt very natural. It didn't feel forced. And I think friends are such an important ally in times of tragedy and trauma. Um, but again, I'm hearing that word acceptance. They just accepted that something had happened, and that I needed them there, but in a way that wasn't intrusive and wasn't, um, there were no expectations, which I found really, really useful. Because I think it is hard. I think people don't know how to deal with people who've been through a tragedy, who've suffered a bereavement. People don't always know how to act. And I've seen quite a lot of judgment from people who are bereaved. I've seen quite a lot of judgment on people who may not have said the right thing or may not have done the right thing. But I've always said I would much rather somebody said something than nothing. I would hate it if somebody saw me and felt they needed to cross the street because they didn't know what to say to me. Um, but I think there is quite a lot of judgment from those who are bereaved as to what is the right thing, what is the wrong thing. But I've very much taken the attitude that if somebody wants to help, there are things that are more helpful than others. But I think anything that you can offer somebody who's been bereaved is valid.
Yeah, I agree with you on that in many ways. I do think that, one of the things I've noticed on my own grief journey, because talking about a stillbirth child and even suicide are two things that I've caught on to that people do not know how to talk about.
Yeah,
It's very much a taboo thing. I don't want to
yeah,
talk about it. I'll let you just heal on your own path. And
yeah,
that creates a lot of isolation for people that go through losses like us. And I do know, because I had to walk that very isolated in my own path, that that's a hard journey, a very hard one. Because when you have
yeah,
to sit with that by yourself, it gets very loud, it gets very heavy, and it's very hard to navigate that grief. And I do think that, um, one thing I wish that people who are going to be around somebody who's bereaved or somebody who's going through grief and loss, is you don't always have to say the right thing, but there are some things that you've got to be mindful about. And one of those things I learned on my own journey in particular was I did have a lot of people say, well, you can't stay stuck in your grief. Well, this did happen, but life moves on. You got to move forward somehow. And that's where, when it comes to child loss in particular, you can't tell a parent that's lost their child that life goes on. It doesn't work that way because
Yeah,
we did life out of order. We're supposed to die before our
yeah,
kids. That's just how it's
yeah,
supposed to be. But now it's out of order for us, and now we have to live every day saying, what would this have been like, or what would they be like if they were here, or what would this be, or how do we celebrate birthdays? How do we still honor them, create a legacy? So the whole idealism around that of getting over it or moving on doesn't really work. I like to say there's moving through it or moving forward from it, because we're never going to leave that behind. It's always going to be something that's still a part of our life. And what I really wish a lot of people would understand about being around bereavement is that you don't always need to fill the void with empty chatter, but fill it with giving that space, like Jane talked about, of making people feel seen and heard and understood. It doesn't have to make sense to you, it doesn't have to be logical, but give them that space to just be who they are in that moment because that's what they're capable of, and that's where they're at. And I think that acknowledging and accepting where someone's at in that grief journey, no matter where it is, no matter what state they're in, accepting them for who they are can be so powerful to help somebody through that next phase of their grief.
yeah. And I think accepting that we are actually still the same people. Our circumstances have changed, but we fundamentally haven't changed as people. It changes an awful lot of stuff, but fundamentally we are still the person that we were before. I think there's a difference between your role changing. You know, I still find it hard when people ask how many children I've got because I had two and I still have two, but one just doesn't live on this earth anymore. And that's a hard question. Um, but although I feel that I am still a parent, my role within that has changed, but me as a person, I'm still me. Um, and so acknowledging that I'm still me and that I'm not a different person just because this has happened to me is really important. And I think that that idea of moving forward with the grief instead of moving forward either from it or moving, getting past it. I mean, there is no getting past it, is there? Because, like you say, we are going to live the rest of our lives without the child that we thought we were going to have our whole lives with. And that does put a very different perspective on life, but it doesn't fundamentally change who we are as people. And so I think for people to acknowledge that and allow us that space to work through it, live with it, and acknowledge it as a part of our journey. Just like, getting a new job might be part of your journey, or moving house might be part of your journey. It doesn't fundamentally change who you are. Obviously, grief and losing a child is far bigger than any of those things. And I think people do struggle to understand it because until you've experienced it, you couldn't possibly understand it. And I don't expect anybody to understand it unless they've been through it. So it is helpful to talk to people who have been through it. I know when we first spoke, there is just that silent understanding because we both have been there. We both know that our lives are now topsy-turvy and out of order, and we are now living without something that we thought we were going to have forever. But like you say, even if you don't understand it, doesn't mean you can't still be there for that person and accept and just I have learned very much the difference between sympathy and empathy. A lot of people have been very sympathetic, but the people who really feel it, not necessarily because they've been through it, but they just feel it. I find those people have been, for me, the most helpful, that they kind of feel it with you without judgment, without expectation, and kind of accept that there are going to be good days, there are going to be bad days, and that things have changed, that our lives are now, permanently changed, which it's a hard concept, I think, to get your head around the fact that somebody's life is irreversibly changed because of what they've been through. Um,
Yeah, I think
so
it's one of
yeah,
those things with grief that people think grief is linear. They think that,
yeah,
there's going to be a point where you're over it, so to speak, and you're moving
yeah,
on. And, in child loss in particular, and you and I have lost children on different spectrum, different cause. But at the same point, like you said, and I wanted to build upon that, which is you're going to have days where you feel fine. You're going to feel days
yeah,
where it's normal, so to speak. But you're gonna have days where you take 10 steps backwards and that day just is off and it hurts and it still
yeah,
comes back like the day it happened. And that's where I'm glad you brought up the difference between sympathy and empathy. I appreciate people who are sympathetic and I get it.
yeah,
The people that are empathetic though, the people that can sit there and say, what can I learn from this person's experience, or how can I hold space for them, or I can see how that would be really be hurtful, or I can see how that's really hard to move through or move forward with. And I can understand where they're at today. Those people that are empathetic, that try to understand you, try to listen to you, try to get where you're at, try to go to your level of what you experience, those people are very, very key to helping people go through grief. And that's why
yeah,
I do recommend to people I coach, depending on your loss, if you've lost somebody to suicide, sadly, the best person you could talk to is somebody who's lost somebody by suicide. They're going to get
yeah,
you and understand you. They're not going to say
yeah,
things that are out of place. People like me, if you've lost a stillborn, go to the lost parent community. It's not a part of a club you should be part of, but those are the people that are going to say, I get you and I understand you, and you're not crazy.
yeah,
You're on this train just like
100%.
I am. I can
Yeah,
empathize with you. Let's walk this thing together. Um,
yeah,
so I, I always encourage people that grief is something that we need to change the stigmas around, and even suicide for that matter. There's so many stigmas around that need to be changed because you're not going to be the only person that goes through this. And I don't say that to write things off, but I say this to the following: you're not the only person that experienced it, but you now have a gift of helping other people who are going to go through it. And you're going to be that light for somebody that goes through it. And to say, I've walked this journey, it's not easy. It is not going to be something that's comfortable. And it's not going to be something that you're going to feel better a week, a month, even a year after. You're not going to feel the same. And your life isn't going to be the same. And that's going to give some comfort and some empathy and some solace to people who go through the same walk of life you've gone through. And that's where the human connection of grief, not being linear, but grief being a messy journey of ups and downs, that's where we find the human collective come together. And that's where we find that there's meaning and purpose behind this. There's a way for us to move forward together. And that's where these moments of tragedy that we go through don't have to be in those very hard, heavy emotions we talked about earlier, about guilt and shame and blame, but they can become something that becomes very useful to us in the collaborative connections of life and helping other people walk that same journey, so that we don't have to feel alone. We can feel like we have commonality with one another and we can help and support one another through this. So I see grief as a very transformational process, and I don't expect everybody who goes through a loss right away to see that, because that's not what I'm talking about. What I am saying is you've got to go through that grief process in your own way, in your own form. But just know on the other side of that, when you are ready and when it presents itself to you, you are going to be somebody that can help somebody else through those situations. And that's where the gift will come out in those moments.
yeah, hugely. And I think that time will be at different times for different people, and some people do, will take a lot longer to get there. Um, because I think for some people that the guilt, the trauma does sit with them heavier, and it takes them a lot more time to get over it. And I think the relationship that you have with the person that's died does affect that as well. But I think the strength of your support network is absolutely crucial. And I completely agree with you, is surround yourself with people that help you, not those that hinder you. And I think I totally agree. I mean, I have found the groups that I'm in to be really, really useful, but equally, there are a couple of bereaved by suicide groups that I've had to come out of because I found them it was quite a negative spiral downwards, and that was not what I needed. I think those people in those groups probably and hopefully do get something from that, and they do get some comfort from that, and they obviously need to share those elements of it. They need to share the guilt and the trauma, but that wasn't helpful to me. So I think even within the space that we're in, there are different elements, and I think it's about finding the right people within that space as much as just finding that space. And if you're not finding it helpful, and if you're not finding the comfort that you need from being within that space, it's okay to step back. It's okay to say, do you know what, this group isn't for me. And the groups I found most helpful for me in my circumstance are those that are using it to help them move forward with the grief, and are not using it as a platform to wallow and deal with the guilt, etc. So I think you do find your tribe even with people who've had similar experiences, because we do all deal with it differently. But I think finding your tribe and finding those people who will carry you and hold space for you and be helpful to you is so, so important. And I will say teens, those teenagers have been such a massive part of that for me. We've not had one moment where I've thought, gosh, they're seeing this in a really negative way. They just haven't. They're quite matter of fact teenagers, and I think sometimes we need to give them credit, more credit than they often get. But yeah, it's about finding those people who really help you and help you move forward and support you in ways that you might not even have realized. If you'd have asked me 3 years ago if I'd have been hanging out with teenagers and doing this, that, and the other, probably would have said yes at school because that was my job. But actually now I genuinely hang out with teenagers, and I find their outlook on life really refreshing. They have been part of my tribe and part of my healing. And it's why I do the work that I do, because it empowers me as much as anything else. And I look at them and I just think, wow, you guys, the way you're dealing with this is really, really impressive and uplifting. So yeah, it's helped me massively being around the right people.
Well, Jane, I just wanted to say thank you so much for being a guest on today's episode of the Empower Grief Journey. This has been a real honor to get to hear your story about Leo and what you've made from that loss of him taking his own life. I think in many, many ways, I think he's given you a very big gift and a very big blessing to help other teens who may have similar thoughts or may have patterns of wanting to take their own life, and helping them navigate that journey so that they don't have to, and showing them that there's another option and another way, by getting the support they actually need and helping raise awareness in that community. I think that's such a beautiful gift that Leo gave you. And I wanted to build off really quickly. If you had asked me if I was going to be in the grief coaching space 5 years ago, I would have said the same thing as you. I would have said, I'm not sure I'd be here, honestly. I don't think I would be doing this.
Yeah,
But grief puts us on these trajectories that we don't often expect.
it does, and I think it makes you reevaluate your life in ways that you probably would never have. I wouldn't be on this journey now. I wouldn't be where I am now. I'd probably still be in teaching and still be quite unhappy. So I do, it's a strange emotion to talk about, but I do actually live with quite a lot of gratitude. as to the people that I've met and the journey that I've been on since, because it has been such a massive learning curve, but there have been so many positives to come out of it, which I know I do know some people find it very odd that I talk about positives, but I think in any circumstance you do take positives from it, and as you say, it can lead you down, the worst trauma can lead you down such a different pathway. But if you look for the glimmers, they are there, and the cause for gratitude is there. And no matter how difficult your journey is, there will always be those glimmers and that sense of hope and sense of purpose. So
Well,
yeah, so
Jane,
thank you very much for having me. It does really help me to share Leo's story, and it really helps me to know that part of his legacy is going to help others.
well,
So
I'm
thank
really
you.
you're very, very welcome, and I'm really glad you and I got to connect from across the pond, if you will.
Yes,
Uh,
yeah.
so, so before we wrap up the show, I wanted to ask if people want to connect with you after listening to this episode, where can they find you?
So my company is Bright Futures Coaching. I am on Facebook as Bright Futures Coaching and on Instagram as Bright Futures Coaching UK, so they can connect in that way. I do also have a website. It's slightly under construction at the moment, but that is brightfuturescoaching.co.uk. And I've also got a link tree which has everything on it. So a link tree / Bright Futures Coaching. But yeah, look out for Bright Futures Coaching. Jane Johnson is my name, so I am the one linked to that. I think there is another company called Bright Futures Coaching, but they don't do the same as what I do. So look out for teen coaching and yeah, Bright Futures Coaching on socials.
Well, for listeners today who are listening to this episode, go to the show notes when you get done with the podcast. I will have all of Jane's links on there so you guys can connect with her on social media and her website. And again, Jane, thank you so much for being on the show today. I want to thank all of our listeners for joining Jane and I on today's episode of the Empower Grief Journey podcast. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with somebody you know who could benefit from Jane's story. For more episodes that are designed to empower you and support you during your grief journey, visit empowergriefjourney.com and subscribe to this podcast. You can find us on Apple and Spotify. The Empower Grief Journey is all about honoring your journey, embracing your emotions, and finding strength in your own time. I want you to know you're never alone on this journey, and together we can navigate grief with courage and compassion. Until next time, be kind to yourself until next time, be kind to yourself and take your grief journey one step at a time.